Step away from the F-35, the mechanic screamed. She ignored him, entered the cockpit and took off the air in the hangar complex at Joint Base. Andrews was not air, but a heavy, viscous fluid composed of atomized jet fuel, pulverized concrete dust, and the stale metallic tang of ozone lingering from the last high-powered engine test run. It settled on everything, on the pristine titanium skin of the F-35s nestled in their bays, on the stacked pallets of specialized lubricants, and most heavily on Cabo Silva. Silva moved with the slow, almost ceremonial rhythm of a deep-sea diver, the mop in her hands a tool of meditation rather than simple sanitation. She was officially designated as Maintenance Utility Staff, which translated crudely to the cleaner. Her fatigues were always 2 shades darker than everyone else's, perpetually soaked, not with sweat, but with the irreducible residue of the motor pool, grease, brake fluid, and the fine abrasive dust that seemed to breed beneath the wings of the heavy transport aircraft. It was road 30 hours. The hangar, A-Bay North, was usually silent save for the hum of the ventilation system and the distant lonely clang of a wrench dropped somewhere far down the line. But Silva's quiet was about to be broken by the sound she most despised, the crisp, rapid thud, thud, thud of highly polished boots approaching too fast, indicating not urgency, but manufactured self-importance. Silva paused, resting the head of the well-worn synthetic mop against the slick, polished floor where she had just spent 20 minutes eradicating a stain left by a leaking APU. She didn't look up, but her shoulders, narrow beneath the heavy fabric of the Army-issue blouse, tightened imperceptibly. She knew that stride. It belonged to Sergeant First Class Brennan, Logistics, Supply Depot 3. Brennan was the physical embodiment of desk-bound bureaucracy, impeccably pressed uniform, rank insignia that looked freshly minted, and a perpetual air of irritated superiority, usually directed at anyone whose primary job involved actual grime. He stopped 3 feet from her, close enough for the faint scent of his expensive mass-market aftershave to cut through the hangar's industrial bouquet. Cabo Silva. Brennan's voice was pitched high, clipped and grating. It carried the metallic echo of someone whose primary communication channel was a telephone receiver. Still playing Cinderella with that mop, I see. Silva slowly dipped the mop head back into the lukewarm water of her bucket, the fiberglass handle groaning faintly. Sergeant, she acknowledged, the word devoid of inflection. Her voice was low, slightly husky, and carried a barely detectable accent, a hard, guttural cadence that hinted at Eastern European lineage. I received your requisition slip, 041 Delta, for the replacement set of ceramic seals for the hydraulics on the C-17 tail fin assembly, Brennan continued, holding a triplicate form between 2 meticulously clean fingers as if it were contaminated waste. Yes, Sergeant. The current seals are degraded. We need them before the phase inspection tomorrow morning. It's a mandatory replacement per the manual. Brennan chuckled, a short, dry, unpleasant sound, like gravel rattling in a tin can. He tapped the form. Well, that's where we run into a small bureaucratic snag, Silva. You listed the request priority as immediate operational necessity. Silva finally raised her head. Her eyes, shadowed beneath the brim of a baseball cap, stained dark with oil, were a piercing, unsettling shade of pale gray. They held a stillness that defied her position. They were the eyes of someone who had seen too much motion, too much chaos, and now prized absolute immobility. The C-17 is scheduled to move a crucial asset deployment window to Ramstein in 48 hours, Sergeant. If the seals fail, the entire bird is grounded indefinitely. That is immediate operational necessity per Regulation 3A, Paragraph 7. Brennan let the form drop slightly, allowing the fluorescent light above to gleam on the silver thread of his rank. See, Silva, that's the problem with you mechanics, and especially utility staff. You think your tiny piece of the puzzle dictates the entire strategy. I allocate resources, and I see a cleaner, a custodian, trying to rush high-value ceramic seals that are slated for a top-tier F-35 program maintenance cycle. He leaned in slightly, his voice dropping in volume but gaining intensity. Tell you what, Silver, why don't you stick to making sure the latrines are sanitized and let the real mechanics worry about operational necessity? I'm downgrading this to standard acquisition. You'll see them in about 3 to 5 business days, maybe. The silence that followed was immense, thick with the chemical smell of solvent. Silver didn't move. She stared at the logistics sergeant, not with anger, but with an unsettling geological patience. Sergeant Brennan, Silver began, her voice barely above a whisper. That aircraft is carrying the advance team for Operation Black Ice. Delaying those SEALs means delaying the operation. I assure you, you do not want that on your ledger. Brennan scoffed, folding the requisition slip dramatically and tucking it into the pristine pocket of his uniform jacket. Threats now? Listen, mop jockey. I've checked your file. Cabo. Cleaning duty. That's all you are. I'm an E6 with 15 years in this system. I know how to play the game. Now get that sludge off my floor before I write you up for insubordination. He made to turn, the rubber heel of his boot squeaking faintly on the damp concrete. He took one step, radiating self-satisfaction, and that was the precise moment the air pressure in the hangar shifted. It wasn't a mechanical change, it was the entry of a predator. The new presence arrived not with hurried steps, but with a deliberate, weighted gait. Thump, thump, thump. Each step resonated with the density of lead and purpose. The sound was distinct from Brennan's frantic patter. It was the measured stride of someone whose weight distribution was perfectly centered, someone who carried the invisible burden of warfighting kit, even when they were stripped down to fatigues. Sergeant Brennan froze mid-pivot. Even his practiced arrogance faltered in the face of this new energy. The man who entered Hangar A Bay North was massive, but moved with the liquid grace of a jungle cat. He wore non-regulation boots, custom-laced, and fatigues that seemed to have been tailored to his explosive physique. His arms, thick with corded muscle, bore the faded sleeve patch of Joint Special Operations Command, specifically identifying him as Major Karski, Grom Liaison Advisor. His face was granite, carved deep with the shadows of too many sleepless nights in too many hot zones, and currently wore an expression of profound, chilling disinterest, a look usually reserved for reviewing casualty lists. Karski wasn't carrying the standard sidearm. Slung across his chest, resting where the heavy Kevlar plates would normally sit, was a custom-fitted HK-416, its black matte finish dull from constant handling, adorned with specialized optics and a short suppressor. It wasn't merely a rifle, it was an extension of the man, and its presence in the motor pool was an immediate glaring irregularity. Karski stopped directly beside Silver's cleaning bucket. He didn't look at Brennan. He looked at the mop water, then at the grease stains Silver had just successfully removed. "Good job," Karski said, his voice a low rumble, the accent thicker and older than Silver's, undeniably Polish. It was the sound of bedrock grating against steel. Silver simply nodded, her eyes still on Brennan, who was now sweating faintly under the collar of his stiff uniform. "Major," Brennan stammered, attempting to recover his composure by snapping to attention, a movement that looked utterly ridiculous next to Karski's natural inherent posture of readiness. "Sergeant First Class Brennan, Logistics. Can I assist you, Major? This area is restricted to maintenance personnel at this hour." Karski turned his head slowly, and the Major's eyes, a brilliant, disconcerting blue, fixed on Brennan. They were eyes that had seen the very definition of human malice and found it tedious. "I know who you are, Sergeant Brennan," Karski said, the name pronounced like an unpleasant fact. "I was looking for my team's liaison officer, but I seem to have arrived just in time to hear you explain the complex mechanics of operational necessity to a cabo." Brennan puffed up slightly, seizing the opportunity to regain control. "Major, with all due respect, I am merely implementing established supply chain protocols. Cabo Silver here is requesting highly sensitive materials with an inappropriate priority code. She is utility staff. She needs to understand her place in the chain of command. Karski shifted the rifle slightly on his chest. The heavy, dark metal of the weapon grazed the rim of the yellow cleaning bucket. Her place, Karski repeated, the phrase hanging in the fetid air. He didn't raise his voice, but the sudden density of silence made the statement sound like an execution order. He took one deliberate step closer to Brennan, forcing the logistics sergeant to swallow hard. Karski was not aggressive. He was simply overwhelming. "Sergeant," Karski stated, "you are refusing priority materials needed to maintain an aircraft designated for Black Ice deployment, a mission that involves my unit, Grom Task Force 14, and the movement of critical intelligence packages." "Major, I understand the importance," Brennan whined, gesturing towards Silver, "but I cannot allow a low-ranking—" "Quiet," Karski interrupted. It was not a request. Brennan's mouth snapped shut. Karski then did something utterly unexpected. He ignored Brennan entirely and stepped directly in front of Silver. He reached out and, with the precision of a surgeon, lifted the brim of her oil-stained baseball cap. Silver didn't flinch. She allowed it. Under the harsh fluorescent lights, the entirety of Cabo Silva was revealed. She was young, perhaps mid-20s, but exhaustion etched deep lines around her mouth. Most notably, however, was the stark, raw skin exposed at her temples and neck. Where most soldiers wore identification dog tags, Silva wore only a thin leather cord, and visible just above the collarbone, peeking out from beneath the collar of her worn uniform, was the faded, yet undeniable ribbon of the Krzyż Waleczny, the Polish cross of valor. Karski's eyes fixed on the ribbon. He looked at the humble corporal, the cleaner, holding a mop, and then at the ribbon, worn thin by sweat and time. A profound, chilling stillness fell over the hangar. It was the silence of history crashing into the present moment. Karski, the elite operator, dropped his gaze slightly lower, reading the faint, intricate scarring on her exposed neck, the unmistakable signature of a blast trauma surgeon's work. He then looked at Brennan, who was standing rigid with confusion and fear, having realized too late that he had walked into a minefield he couldn't even see. Karski did not speak immediately. He reached out slowly, deliberately, and with the utmost care, he peeled back the collar of Silver's blouse, just enough to reveal the attached metal of the medal. It was not a recent presentation. The bronze was dull, handled, and the details of the inscription were partially obscured by years of wear. Karski closed his eyes for a fraction of a second, inhaling deeply, then reopened them. He began to speak, not to Brennan, but to the medal itself, narrating its history in the cavernous acoustics of the silent hangar. The Krzyż Waleczny. Karski's voice was now thick with reverence, cutting through the logistical snobbery of Brennan like a laser through sheet metal. The Cross of Valor, not for rank, not for service tenure, awarded only for deeds directly constituting an act of valor on the field of combat, bidder for action above and beyond the call of duty, often involving exceptional personal risk, usually in direct confrontation with the enemy. He paused, letting the weight of the words settle. The award regulations state that to receive the Krzyż Waleczny, one must have personally engaged the enemy, performed a life-saving rescue under fire, or demonstrated command excellence after the loss of superior officers, ensuring mission success where failure was certain. He finally looked at Brennan, his eyes radiating pure, frozen command. "This is not a participation ribbon, Sergeant. This is the mark of someone who has earned the right to refuse orders from their superiors if those orders endanger the mission. I suggest you start thinking about exactly how someone who now holds the designation Cabo Utility Staff came to wear the Cross of Valor." Brennan tried to speak, but only managed a choked gasp. I didn't see the ribbon, Major." "Uniform regulations." Karski cut him off with a gesture of cold dismissal. He moved past the logistics sergeant, taking the position of the narrator, the historian, the witness. He began the story, his words forming a cinematic script in the quiet space, detailing the events that had stripped Silva of everything but her core competence, and ultimately delivered her to the indignity of a mop and bucket. Act 3, The Shadow of the Past, Operation Red Dust. The year was 2018. The place was a desolate, sun-scoured stretch of mountainous terrain, 80 kilometers southwest of Kunduz, Afghanistan. The heat was a physical enemy, a relentless hammer striking the nape of the neck, sapping strength through the pores. Cabo Silva, then known by her call sign, Wojtek, was a highly trained combat engineer and forward observer attached to a specialized NATO stabilization unit, Task Force Hussar. She was small, even slight, but the weight of her kit defied her frame. 85 pounds of equipment, the PKM light machine gun, 200 rounds belted, 5 additional belts in her pack, mortar rounds for the 60-minute unit, EOD tools, water, and enough specialized comms equipment to run an air traffic control tower. Every pound had been earned through blood and relentless discipline. The air was so dry it cracked the skin on the lips. The silence was deceptive, broken only by the crunch of their own boots on the fine, talc-like red dust and the rhythmic, labored breathing of the 5-man patrol. They were moving through a narrow wadi, a dry riverbed, the ideal kill zone. Wojtek was positioned at the front, her job to identify and clear the inevitable improvised explosive devices, IEDs. Her concentration was absolute. It had to be. In that environment, a lapse of focus was not a mistake. It was an execution. She scanned the ground, not looking for the obvious, but for the subtle disturbances. The barely visible glint of a tripwire, the fractionally different shade of dust indicating recent burial, the misplaced pebble that defied the natural chaos of the desert floor. She breathed in measured cycles, 4 counts in, 4 counts hold, 6 counts out. It stabilized the tremor in her hands and forced oxygenated blood to her optical nerves. Maciej, she whispered into the mic, referring to Sergeant Maciej Kowalski, the patrol leader walking 2 meters behind her. Pressure plate indicators, 2 meters ahead, fresh dust disruption, depth approximately 6 inches. Confirmed, Wojtek. Maciej's voice was strained, heavy with the knowledge that his life rested on her minute observations. Clear it. Wojtek knelt. The heat radiating off the ground was enough to blister exposed skin. She shed her pack silently, easing the PKM onto the dirt. The muzzle pointed safely downrange. She used a thin, modified probe, steel alloy specifically chosen not to activate magnetic fuses. She worked with the delicacy of a watchmaker, moving the probe in lateral, widening sweeps. The device was sophisticated, a command-detonated deep charge, wired to a low-frequency radio trigger, disguised beneath a pressure plate decoy. It was intended to draw the team in, make them complacent, before the secondary, larger charge was triggered remotely. For 30 agonizing minutes, surrounded by the oppressive silence and the watchful, empty eyes of the surrounding ridges, Wojtek disarmed the network. She clipped the detonator lines, insulated the exposed conductors, and gently extracted the main charge, a terrifying canister packed with fertilizer and scrap metal shrapnel. "Clear," she whispered, wiping sweat and dust from her forehead, leaving a streak of clean skin on the grime. They continued the patrol, the incident serving only to sharpen the razor edge of their collective tension. They knew they were deep in the lion's den, hunting a high-value target who trafficked in weapons and child recruitment. Their mission was static observation, establishing an undetected OP on the high ground overlooking the primary road junction. As they began the final ascent up the shale-covered slope leading to the observation post, Maciej signaled for a break. 5 minutes, he radioed. Hydrate. Wojtek, check your 6. Wojtek settled near a cluster of jagged, heat-shattered rocks. She took a slow, deep pull from her hydration bladder. The water was lukewarm and tasted faintly of plastic, but it was life. She raised her binoculars, scanning the distant, hazy horizon. That's when she saw the anomaly. It wasn't movement. It was color. A flash of bright, unnatural green caught her eye, the the distinct coloration of specific high-tech camouflage netting positioned perfectly on a distant ridge, designed to obscure an antenna or perhaps a heavy weapon emplacement. Maciej, contact, 1200 meters, 085 direction, Wojtek reported instantly. Possible observation post, high-grade netting, too clean for locals. Before Maciej could answer, the air ripped apart. It wasn't the dull thud of a mortar. It was the sharp, percussive crack of a heavy-caliber round impacting rock directly next to Maciej's head. Ksh! The spray of pulverized shale and hot metal shrapnel erupted. Maciej collapsed, his helmet clattering down the slope. Contact! Sniper fire! They're ranging us! Wojtek screamed, instantly dropping flat, swinging the PKM around. The enemy had initiated the engagement from the hidden OP she had just spotted. The geometry of the valley made their position a perfect firing range. "Smoke! Get smoke out!" shouted Janek, the medic. But before the smoke grenades could be deployed, the secondary barrage hit. A pre-ranged mortar team, a minimum of 82mm rounds, began to walk their fire directly onto the patrol's position. The first mortar round landed 30 feet away. The blast wave hit Wojtek like a physical fist to the chest, driving the air from her lungs. Dirt, fragmentation, and concussive shock rocked the small group. "Maciej is down! Leg and head wound!" Janek screamed. Wojtek, adrenaline flooding her system, ignored the ringing silence in her ears and the involuntary tremors in her hands. She pushed herself up onto her knees, peering through the settling dust. Maciej was bleeding profusely, unconscious. "Janek, patch him! Get tourniquets high!" Wojtek barked, instantly assuming command, not by official order but by pure reactive competence. "Krzysztof, suppressive fire! I need a clear sector at the 085 target." The sniper was still active, pinning their heads down. The incoming mortar fire was growing closer, zeroing in. They had maybe 90 seconds before the concentration of rounds rendered the position non-survivable. "We move now!" Wojtek yelled. "We pull back 30 meters to that rock cluster. Janek, you drag Maciej. Krzysztof, cover fire." But the drag was slow. Maciej, a big man, was dead weight. They were exposed on the open slope. Wojtek saw the flash. A mortar round specifically aimed at the dragging unit was incoming. She didn't think. The action was purely autonomic, drilled into her muscle memory through years of relentless training. She dropped the PKM, sprinting toward Janek and the wounded Maciej. "Down!" she roared. She shoved Janek clear, throwing him and Maciej violently behind a small outcropping of rock, just as the mortar round impacted exactly where they had been standing a second earlier. The blast was deafening, concussive, and overwhelming. Wojtek, exposed to the full force, felt as if her entire skeleton had momentarily dissolved. Her head whipped back, slamming against a rock face. A spray of liquid warmth coated her neck and shoulder. She collapsed, tasting metallic grit and blood. The explosion had been close enough to temporarily stun the enemy sniper. The suppression fire from Krzysztof and the second rifleman, Piotr, intensified. Wojtek forced herself to focus. Her ears were useless. All she heard was a high-pitched, insistent electronic whine. Her vision swam, but the objective remained. They had to survive. They had to get Maciej out. She crawled back to the position, ignoring the blinding pain in her neck and the sticky wetness covering her uniform. The moment she reached Janek, she realized the extent of her injury. A substantial piece of shrapnel had torn through the muscle mass of her shoulder and neck, missing the carotid artery by millimeters. The blood loss was immediate and severe. "Janek!" she choked out, pointing to the comms unit. "Comms. Need extraction. Grid 40, Alpha 7. We are overrun. Need CAS and immediate medevac." Janek was shaking uncontrollably, attempting to stabilize Maciej, who was barely breathing. Wojtek grabbed the radio handset herself, thumbing the transmit button. "Whiskey 01, this is Wojtek. We are taking direct and indirect fire. Patrol leader down. I am hit. Requesting immediate tactical fire mission and QRF insertion." "Say again, immediate," the radio crackled. Wojtek, we have you localized. QRF is 15 minutes out. We have no KS window. 15 minutes was an eternity. The enemy was closing in. She could hear the distinct sound of AK fire intensifying, rounds impacting closer, kicking up plumes of dust. Negative command, Wojtek yelled into the mic, ignoring the burning in her lungs. We are compromised. They are flanking the wadi. If we stay, we die. She looked at her team. Yannick immobilized with the wounded leader. Christoph and Piotr running low on ammunition, fighting a defensive battle they couldn't win. Wojtek made the ultimate decision. She scrambled back to the PKM, which lay half buried in the dust. She hauled the heavy weapon back to her shoulder, ignoring the scream of pain from her new wounds. Krzysztof! Piotr! Move! 30 meters down the slope! I cover! They hesitated, looking at her, a small figure bleeding heavily, taking the point. Now! That's an order! She roared, her voice shredded raw, but cutting through the chaos. As the two remaining riflemen began their low tactical sprint, Wojtek opened fire. The PKM is a beast of a weapon, designed for sustained, overwhelming volume. Wojtek didn't fire short bursts. She laid down a continuous, hammering stream of 7.62-minute rounds, aimed directly at the muzzle flashes emanating from the high ground and the approaching flankers in the wadi. The sound was immense, a deep, resonant thud, thud, thud that echoed across the valley, a terrifying, unstoppable wall of lead. She fired until the barrel glowed, until the air around the weapon shimmered with heat haze, pushing the weapon to and beyond its designated operational limits. She emptied 200 rounds in less than 60 seconds, forcing the enemy to pull back, diving for cover, breaking their coordinated advance. It bought the patrol 40 seconds, enough time for Yannick to drag Mathieu down to the designated cluster of rocks and for the two riflemen to reach cover. The enemy, infuriated by the sudden, terrifying suppression, retaliated instantly. They directed all available fire, machine guns, RPGs, and the mortars at Wojtek's lone position. Wojtek kept firing, shifting targets, ensuring the enemy never knew exactly where her fire was originating, even as the incoming rounds chewed up the ground around her. She was a magnet for destruction, absorbing the impact so her team could escape. A round, likely a direct hit from an RPG backblast, finally struck the rock shielding her lower body. The pain was immediate, blinding, paralyzing, but she held the trigger down for one more 6-round burst before her fingers went slack. She collapsed, the rifle falling silent. The sudden absence of the massive machine gun fire was a palpable vacuum. The enemy mistook the silence for death. They started to advance again, cautiously. Wojtek, operating solely on shock and the last vestiges of adrenaline, reached into her kit with a trembling, bloody hand. She pulled out her final piece of ordnance, a claymore mine, designed to be deployed against advancing infantry. She set the directional charge, aimed low into the wadi, where she knew the flanking element was moving, and rolled herself 20 feet away, pressing the trigger just as the first enemy fighters rounded the bend. The massive blast of the claymore detonated, spraying thousands of steel ball bearings. The resulting screams and the sudden cessation of movement confirmed the tactical success. Wojtek lay bleeding, exhausted, but breathing. She had stopped the assault. She had saved her team leader and the rest of the unit. By the time the QRF arrived, she was slipping into shock, but she was still conscious enough to give a status report. Target neutralized, extraction point secure, focus on maquillage. For this action, for taking command, executing a near-suicidal defense, saving her unit while severely wounded, and ensuring mission success, she was awarded the Krzyż Walecznych, personally decorated by a visiting dignitary months later in a field hospital. The medals didn't save her career, however. The extensive damage to her neck and spine, combined with the catastrophic PTSD and resulting complications, meant a medical discharge was inevitable. But she refused to leave the service. She took the massive demotion, the pay cut, and the indignity, insisting on staying attached to a US base in any capacity, even if it meant scrubbing floors. As long as she remained connected to the mission, Connected to the operational environment she had sacrificed everything to protect. Act 4. The revelation and the honor Major Karski finished the tale. He didn't use the names Maciej, Yannick, or Christoph. He used only the call sign, Wojtek. He summarized the action with cold, technical precision, describing the sustained fire, the exposure to the blast, and the subsequent deployment of the Claymore. The silence that followed this compressed, brutal narrative was total. Sergeant Brennan was no longer merely uncomfortable. He was pale, his eyes wide and unfocused, fixed on the Krzyż Walecznych ribbon, now clearly visible on Cabo Silva's uniform. He was breathing in shallow, rapid gasps. The gap between his arrogant logistical world and the brutal reality of combat operations had just been bridged by a 2,000-word testimony of pain and valor. Karski finally turned his attention back to Brennan, his voice now dangerously low. Cabo Silva, Karski stated, using her rank with the deepest, most formal respect, was offered a full medical discharge, a lifetime pension, and a position consulting on tactical engineering. She refused. She chose to stay, maintaining the very infrastructure that supports the missions she nearly died to complete. She requested no special recognition. She merely requested to stay in the fight, however humble her role. Karski stepped aside, indicating the Cabo, who still held the mop handle, her pale grey eyes fixed unblinkingly on Brennan. "You, Sergeant," Karski continued, the sheer contempt in his tone making the logistics man wince. "You denied mission-critical seals to the operational element of Black Ice, and you did it out of petty spite and ego, referring to a Cross of Valor recipient as a mop jockey and a cleaner," Brennan stammered, his face slick with cold sweat. "Major, I swear I didn't know. I never saw the ribbon. Uniform code violation." "Silence!" Karski roared, the sound echoing off the F-35 bays. The sheer volume sent Brennan staggering backward a full step. Karski pointed to the crumpled requisition form Brennan had stuffed into his pocket. "You will retrieve that form. You will stamp it P1, maximum operational priority. You will personally ensure those ceramic seals are delivered to A-Bay North by 0600, or I will initiate a formal, direct JSOC inquiry into your fitness for command and adherence to mission support protocols. I will strip every stripe off your sleeve and leave you sweeping the motor pool for real." Brennan fumbled, his hands shaking so violently he had difficulty extracting the paperwork. He dropped it twice. He finally picked it up, pulled out his stamp, and with a shaky hand, slammed the P1 approval down. "Yes, Major, it will be done. Immediately. I apologize. Cabo Silva, my deepest apologies." His voice cracked with genuine, belated terror. Karski didn't acknowledge the apology. He watched Brennan scurry away, his polished boots now making a terrified, chaotic tap, tap, tap retreat toward the supply depot. When Brennan was gone, the enormous quiet settled again. Karski turned to Silva. The intensity faded from his eyes, replaced by a profound, weary brotherhood. "Wojtek," he said, using her old call sign, a name that signified the highest respect in his culture. "It is good to see you again. I thought, after Kunduz." "I survived, Major," Silva said softly, lowering the mop. "You know how stubborn I am." Karski gave a faint, tight smile. "I do." The scars told the story. He paused, his blue eyes studying her face. "Why the mop, Wojtek? Why here?" Silva looked around the massive hangar at the F-35s sitting like silent, deadly birds of prey. "Someone has to keep the engines clean, Major. Someone has to make sure the foundation is solid. The front line is nothing without the bedrock beneath it." Karski nodded, a deep, understanding acknowledgement. He respected her choice, even if he didn't understand the depth of her self-imposed penance. He unslung the HK-416 from his chest. This was not a standard-issue weapon. It was an implement of his craft, meticulously maintained, customized to perfection, and infused with the spirit of every mission he had survived. The composite finish was scratched, the grip worn smooth, and it had a faint metallic scent of hot brass and distant gunpowder. He held the rifle horizontally, buttstock pointing toward himself, muzzle toward the cabo. It was the traditional, solemn presentation of trust and respect among elite operators. "Wojtek," Karski said, his voice dropping to a near whisper, "I am going out on a long trip. I won't need this where I am going next. This rifle, Vigilance, has been with me through 3 continents and 12 close calls. It is the only thing I've ever truly relied upon. I want you to hold it for me. I want it to be protected by the cleanest, most solid foundation I know." He placed the rifle carefully into the hands of Cabo Silva. The cold weight of the weapon was startling against her palms, a stark contrast to the fiberglass handle of the mop. Silva looked at the rifle, then up at Karski, speechless. Accepting the sacred weapon of an active operator was the ultimate gesture. It meant they trusted her life and their legacy to her care. "Thank you, Major," she finally managed, the words choked with emotion she rarely allowed herself to express. Karski simply touched the brim of her cap, a salute of equals, and turned to leave the hangar, melting back into the shadows from which he came. Silva stood alone, holding the HK-416 in one hand and her worn mop in the other, a corporal of logistics and a warrior of legend, perfectly suspended between her past and her present. Epilogue: the F-35. It was 3 weeks later. The ceramic seals had been successfully installed, and the C-17 had flown its crucial mission. The operational tempo at Andrews had surged, preparing for a major exercise rollout. Cabo Silva was wiping down the exterior service panels of an F-35 Lightning II in Hangar B Delta. The F-35, designated 51 Bravo, was a 5th-generation marvel of engineering, stealth-coated, heavily computerized, and ridiculously complex. It was scheduled for a cross-country ferry flight to Nellis AFB, but the pilot, Captain Jenkins, had called in sick with acute food poisoning. The maintenance team was frantic. The flight slot was non-negotiable. They needed a rated pilot immediately to meet the deadline. Silva paused her work, her eyes catching the faint gleam of the Krzyż-Walecznik ribbon beneath her collar. She still felt the familiar, dull throb in her shoulder, a constant reminder of Kunduz. Suddenly, the maintenance chief, Master Sergeant Dale, rushed into the hangar, clipboard shaking violently. "We're screwed. Jenkins is out. The standby pilot is stuck in traffic. We lose the slot if we don't take off in 20 minutes. The maintenance team descended into pandemonium. Silva quietly set down her mop, its familiar oily scent immediately replaced by the sharp, clean aroma of the HK-416 Vigilance, which she had painstakingly cleaned and now kept locked in her personal locker. She walked purposefully toward the F-35, 51 Bravo. "Hey, Cabo Silva, step away from the F-35! A young mechanic, PFC Harris, yelled at her, mistaking her approach for a cleaning initiative. "You don't touch the canopy, it's sensitive. Get back to the landing gear bay." Silva ignored him. She reached the ladder and began the fluid, familiar ascent toward the open cockpit. "Cabo! That's a direct order! Halt!" Harris screamed, running toward her. Silva reached the lip of the cockpit. She paused, turned, and looked down at the hysterical mechanic. "My apologies, PFC," she said, her voice crisp and clear, without the weariness she usually carried. "I'm rerouting the flight plan. We are not losing this slot." PFC Harris stopped dead. "Rerouting? What are you talking about? You can't even touch the—" Silva slipped into the ejection seat. The cockpit instrumentation, designed to intimidate and overwhelm, held no mystery for her. Her hands moved with the speed and certainty of someone born in the seat. She engaged the internal power. The HUD flickered to life, projecting the complex flight information onto the canopy. "Andrews Tower, this is Lightning 51 Bravo, requesting immediate clearance for ferry run to Nellis," Silva stated into the hot mic, her voice perfectly modulated, professional, and utterly calm. Silence from the tower, followed by a confused, crackling reply. 51 Bravo, confirm pilot identity. We show Captain Jenkins is out." Silva smiled, a small, dangerous upward curl of the lip that the old team knew meant absolute certainty. "Tower, this is Cabo Silva, Call sign Wojtek, she replied, keying the ignition sequence. The F-35's engine whined, the massive jet spooling up with an audible surge of power that shook the hangar floor. I am a necessary substitution. Trust me, I know the machine. PFC Harris and Master Sergeant Dale stared, slack-jawed, as the cabo, the cleaner, the utility staff, manipulated the complex fly-by-wire controls with instinctual ease. The jet began to taxi out of the hangar bay. Tower, I say again, I am a necessary substitution, Silva repeated, looking down the taxiway, feeling the familiar, intoxicating rush of raw power beneath her control. And no one is going to tell me to stick to cleaning latrines today. The F-35, 51 Bravo, surged forward, reaching the runway. A moment later, the terrifying, triumphant roar of the Pratt & Whitney engine filled the sky as Cabo Silva, the cleaner, the Cross of Valor recipient, pulled the stick back, defied protocol, and launched the $50 million fighter jet into the clear blue expanse. She was exactly where she needed to be, in the fight.